Welcome to the Further Reformation podcast. I am Benjamin Hicks, and I'm joined today by Daniel Tyrie. How are you doing today, Daniel?
I'm doing great, Benjamin. Thanks for having me on.
It's my pleasure. The purpose of our discussion today is to discuss the topic of Canadian nationalism, and I think that you're exactly the kind of person that would be able to speak to this. Some of our listeners might be familiar with your writing on X, where you tackle hot button issues from a Canadian perspective. Maybe to just get us started, can you tell us who you are and how did you get involved in politics?
Yeah, my name is Daniel Tyrie. I studied politics at the University of Waterloo. When I graduated in the spring of 2018, it was shortly before the launch of Maxime Bernier's People's Party of Canada. So I kind of dove into that project with 2 feet. Um, I had really developed my kind of positions as a Canadian nationalist and an immigration skeptic, kind of in the kind of post-Trump era. And I was excited. I was disillusioned by the CPC and excited by a new alternative. So I started getting involved at the local level in the People's Party of Canada. I didn't have much political experience at the time. I had done a little bit of door knocking here and there with some conservative campaigns, but nothing of substance. So I started to get involved in the PPC and the in my local area at the time of Kitchener Waterloo. I helped start a bunch of their electoral district associations out there. And from there, I jumped into I decided to come down to Ottawa or Gatineau at the time and volunteer at PPC HQ to help out there. So I kind of just gotten hooked up with a buddy, got in a car and rented an Airbnb and just started volunteering as much as we could at PPC HQ. There was a lot of work to be done and not enough hands to do it. So after about a month of that, I got hired full time by the party in February 2019. And after the 2019 election, I was promoted to executive director of the party. So I kind of was the top staffer for the PPC for about 5 years until last spring, where we had to part ways over a kind of conflict of our general views. So now I'm on my own. I'm a bit of a content creator and an activist online, where I promote Canadian nationalism in the concept of remigration.
Hmm. Well, excellent. I want to say thank you for your service to our country in standing for some important issues. For myself, it's been a very discouraging few years seeing the political landscape, and especially during the COVID lockdowns, was very thankful for the voice of clarity that you and the others brought to some of those issues. So thank you for your service to our country, both under the PPC formally, but also today. And certainly following your writings on X, I think that you have a lot to contribute to the discussion today. And I hope that our listeners will receive what you're saying with an open mind. Now, when you think about advocating for nationalism as you do, maybe you could summarize that for our listeners. They may have misconceptions about what it means to be a Canadian nationalist. Maybe you can explain that for them if they are confused about that.
Yeah, no, I think that's something that people are generally confused about, and it comes with good reason. I think nationalism generally has been kind of uh, subverted and redefined by a series of different politicians who kind of cloak themselves in the flag and use kind of basic nationalist rhetoric to their own kind of political ends, which are not technically nationalists. I would say this has been going on for 50, 70 years at this point. Um, for example, we saw Mackenzie King kind of uh, use this strategy to promote what I'd call continentalism, further integration with the United States. And then we saw folks like Pierre Trudeau uh, use nationalism to further post nationalism and multiculturalism. Most Canadians were brought up through the education system under this kind of multiculturalist post nationalism, where Canada is all about values and multiculturalism and the cultural mosaic and all these concepts. But at the end of the day, nationalism is a pretty simple concept. Uh, to understand it, you just have to go back to literally what the definition of nation is. And nation in the modern context is often used as a synonym for things like country or state. But that's not accurate. A nation is really a group of people with a shared history and culture. Uh, and it's like it's not the laws, it's not the economy, it's the people. So my conception of nationalism, which I think is the authentic conception of nationalism, starts with that concept, which is that the nation is kind of the building block beyond the family. So you have the individual, you have the family, and then you have the nation. And I view Canadians as my extended family, and I believe the role of the government, the role of the state, is to preserve the best interest of our people in our nation. Uh, Increasingly, we see governments that are intertwined in concepts of international law and international human rights, and focused on mass immigration for the benefit of people around the world. And I just think that's completely backwards. I think all policy should be done through a nationalist lens that puts the Canadian people first. I don't agree with people like Pierre Poilievre who say that anyone from anywhere can be a Canadian, that regardless of your name is Martin or Mohammed, Pierre or Patel or whatever he says, everyone is equally Canadian. I believe that there is a historical context to what a Canadian is. This country was settled by British and French and later European settlers. It was built from the ground up, and the descendants of those brave pioneers and explorers are the Canadian people. I believe those settlers came here and underwent an ethnogenesis over hundreds of years on this continent to form unique ethnic groups, Anglo Canadians and French Canadians, and that the modern Canadian state should be focused on preserving, protecting that identity, and doing what's in the best interest of those people.
I think that makes a tremendous amount of sense as you laid it out very carefully. Even from a Christian point of view, when you think about the ancient nation of Israel, when they were in captivity in Egypt and living in a political system controlled by the Egyptian people, they didn't therefore become Egyptians, but they were a distinct people by virtue of their shared lineage and their shared history and their shared identity. And so I think that is also borne out just by a common sense understanding of history, though it may be politically incorrect given
Yeah,
our current political moment, right?
yeah, no, I think Israel's a great example, and even if you start reading through historical context, you'll start noticing the term nation kind of used this way. Like they might refer to the nation of Israel within Egypt. Um, when reading through older bodies of work, anything kind of pre 1980, you see this much more commonly used. But I think uh, Israel, even in modern day, is a great example of how to understand this. To be honest, almost every country outside of the kind of Western world views things through this kind of nationalist lens. And Israel is a great example. Like they have a distinct people in a distinct homeland, and they do whatever is possible to protect the interests of those people and to preserve their ethnic identity into the future. Like Israel is probably one of the most well-known and active ethno states in the world. And I'm just seeking for Canada the same expectations. Whereas in a kind of modern, politically correct world, it's seen that Western countries must be multiculturalist, must accept anyone from anywhere as their own, especially when it comes to Canada and the United States. You know, the new world where it's where we're a bit younger and have uh, less roots than say some European countries. But that's simply not the case. I don't think it bears out historically. If you actually look into uh, the demographics and the flow of settlers and migrants, you can quickly understand the kind of what is truly authentically a Canadian.
Well, I think that is helpful. And it is striking that if you look at something like the Conservative Party, there is a little bit of a schizophrenia involved where they seem to be very keenly committed to the preservation of nations other than their own, right? So when it comes to Ukraine, that people is inviolable and they have a right to a place and a land and a state of their own. When it comes to the modern Zionist state of Israel, they have a similar perspective. But for them, they're very ideologically committed to the consensus view among the Canadian ruling class, which is that our loyalty is not to a people, but to an economic zone, to a um, piece of geography under a certain political jurisdiction, which is ultimately up for grabs, whose identity is fungible and is ultimately in the service of a particular political agenda. So, for example, we're all raised with this concept that when we speak of a nation, it's simply in regards to a legal citizenship, or it's in regard to your adherence to a sort of generic creed like pluralism or multiculturalism. So you can say, yeah, there's a legal definition of this is a Canadian. You can say there's sort of like a deeper thing, which is if you're just accepting of everyone and everything, that's what it means to be truly Canadian. But both of those are fairly recent concepts, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not even just recency. Like I think this concept is more easily understood in most countries around the world. But and even if you just sub in any other country, like if I moved to Japan or China, and even if I got citizenship, um, no one would ever think I'm Japanese. Like that's just not even a controversial statement. But when you sub in the same things for American or Canadian, um, people strip away that kind of citizenship and view it as one thing. Like sure, there's legally Canadian citizens, but that doesn't mean they're Canadians. Just like I could be a Japanese citizen and I would never be Japanese. Um, I think using the examples of those foreign conflicts, as you brought up Israel, Ukraine, is a great example of uh, another one of the kind of adverse effects that we're seeing mass immigration have on our politics. Now, politics instead of as I mentioned earlier, as it should be about providing solutions that best benefit the Canadian people, it's become a contest of pandering to different multicultural ethnic blocs to win votes. Um, there's an incredibly large Ukrainian diaspora population in Canada, the biggest outside of Ukraine anywhere in the world. So we see the political establishment be very careful about their messaging on Ukraine and even going as far to give tens of billions of dollars to support an endless war that has really nothing to do with Canada in order to maintain support amongst this kind of ethnic community. And you can say similarly in terms of Israel. Uh, our politicians are not focused on what's best for our people. They're focused on what can uh, best maintain their power. And at this point, they find it's most expedient to kind of play different ethnic blocks against each other and to kind of maintain their ownerships over different ethnic clientels. And I think that's a toxic effect that'll only uh, worsen things over time. And it's only getting worse and worse as more and more people come into this country and maintain organization amongst those kind of ethnic lines. Um, it's increasingly problematic, and I really think we need to get back to brass tacks and what's best for the Canadian people if our country is going to kind of survive in the long term.
I think that's very well said. Now, when I think about the political scene over the recent years, I do sense that even your average Canadian who may have not thought through these issues as deeply as you have, there's sort of an intuitive sense that things are going very wrong in our country, and it is tied to immigration. So even parties that are extremely mainstream are having to give some piecemeal gestures of restraint towards immigration because the cultural and economic and political ramifications of mass immigration are just being very apparent. But I don't sense that the political parties, generally speaking, actually have a vested interest in changing course in a strong way or in a way towards preserving the historic ethnic makeup of our country. And do you think it's possible for them to get there? And how would that look like?
It definitely is a challenge. These ideas are, well, for one, ethnic blocks are organized politically. They're often organized around kind of charitable or not for profit groups. They're often organized around their different uh, temples and religious organizations or other community groups. And they're willing to act as kind of voting blocks to maintain their interests of their group. Whereas heritage Canadians, ethnic Canadians, are not organized or they have a kind of more individualist nature to them. Um, Not to mention the decline of Christianity and organized religion amongst Canadians gives them fewer kind of communal hubs to organize around. The ones that do exist, Christian churches, I find are much less political than different kind of foreign religions in Canada, at least. And this results in a situation where Canadians, heritage Canadians, are much easier to ignore. There is just politicians like to take the path of least resistance, and if they can more easily win over large groups of voters by pandering to these groups, they'll do exactly that. And there's not the same kind of pathways to win over large amounts of heritage Canadians who are by and large more individualist. So uh, if we are as well, these kind of ideas of this kind of ethnic identity amongst Canadians, this kind of group feel is just has been pushed out of society, especially in the post Pierre Trudeau era. Um, like they've changed all of our institutions to gear around multiculturalism. For generations now, kids have grown up through this concept that Canada is just about values and the cultural mosaic and all these things. So uh, it makes it difficult for people like me, nationalists, to kind of get over that programming. So there's a couple steps before any politician can actually uh, be successful. So I would say the solution starts with um, uh, activists like myself trying to communicate these ideas in a broad sense to make them more common in the general political consciousness, but as well, I think Heritage Canadians need to be more politically organized as a group. And this isn't only done through political parties. That's a one major shortcoming and poor understanding of our political system. Too many people think that politics is just voting every few years, but the reality is we need to be more organized and more put more pressure on our political parties to do better all around the year. And it's not just one party. It's not just the PPC. It's not just the CPC, and so on. I think all political parties need to understand that there's consequences to endlessly pandering to foreigners over the real Canadian people, and that we stand united around a set of ideas. And unless all of them, all the political parties acquiesce and adjust to our expectations, they threaten to lose our support or see it go elsewhere.
Mm. I think that there's probably two kinds of people that nationalists need to win over. There are those who simply need to be explained intellectually that it's a very normal and a very natural and a very ethical thing to love your people and to defend your people. I think there are people who simply just need to be taught that because they've not been exposed to these ideas. And until they're explained that there's a different way to approach statecraft, then they're unlikely to be persuaded. However, I think there is also another group of Canadians, and I think it's increasingly large, who recognize that these things are true, but are frightened about the social costs of taking a stand. And the idea is that in order to actually advocate for what's good for our nation, it's necessary to have courage to the point where people may misunderstand you. They may target you for persecution in academia or politics or even in your livelihood. But going back to what you're saying, our nation was founded by pioneers and conquerors. It wasn't founded by soft men. And perhaps we need to be inspired that if we're going to follow in their footsteps, we need to recapture some of that spirit of our ancestors.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I do think a nationalist kind of outlook on things is the natural outlook on things. Just like organizing yourself around a family is natural, and this is why it's the kind of standard outlook around the world. It's just the Western world, especially the New World, that's trying to like reject this idea and thinking we're kind of past it in some kind of hubristic outlook on things. The reality is, uh, group preferences are real, and there's no shame in standing up for the people that are like your own people. Um, we've seen this like throughout all of history and throughout most of the modern world. It's just Western countries that are trying to reject this for a variety of reasons. And I do think that, ironically, mass immigration has been, while it's had dire consequences on Canadian society, it is kind of uh, almost a self-solving problem in that uh, it's making it more and more clear to heritage Canadians that there are differences between foreigners and our people. There are um, uh, it it pushes us to recognize our ethnic heritage and our similarities, and realize that if we want to keep our country what it was, what it has been throughout history, endless immigration is undermining that. So more and more people are waking up as they flood our country with immigrants and temporary foreign workers and the like.
Yeah, and I think that many people can appreciate that Canadians are a very small people group in the grand scheme of things. And this is the country that our ancestors bequeathed to us. And our ancestors, if they had wished to, they could have moved to India or Pakistan in order to um, find that way of life appealing. But instead, they gave us a way of life that was distinctive to ourselves, that was suitable to our character, to our traditions, to our religious beliefs in many cases. And what I see is that many people are becoming aware that in the very recent past, decisions have been made for us to turn Southern Ontario, cities, say, or other parts of our country into a completely different way of life. And that is something that has huge consequences for our children and grandchildren. We can't expect that we can put the burden on our children and grandchildren of living as minorities under a completely different transformed society without having huge consequences. So some people, what I've seen is that when they start to become aware of these things, it's very easy to simply despair and to just say, yeah, we're all doomed, and it's not actually possible to pass on a good way of life to Canadian children going forward. And so that comes to sort of what, therefore, are we going to advocate for in order to preserve our people and our way of life? More recently, you've seen Maxime Bernier, the PPC, spoke at an Alberta by election about the need for re-immigration. And do you sense that that is something that is becoming more accepted as a topic of discussion among Canadians?
Yeah, I mean, I agree that even people that wake up to these issues in our society do quickly kind of take the proverbial black pill and get very discouraged. This kind of term, demographics is destiny, is popular, and a lot of people see the demographic trends and kind of accept their dire kind of uh, trend. Um, where it looks like we're on pace to be minority white in Canada before 2030. Um, and my response to this is I mean, we don't have to accept what the last generation of politicians did to our society. The politicians that brought all these foreigners here do have the powers to send the foreigners back. So this is the concept of remigration. It's the kind of natural response to the unprecedented and radical policies of mass immigration that have been pushed on our society for the last 40 or so years. It's the return of foreigners to their homelands through a wide variety of policy mechanisms. This concept is becoming popular in kind of European politics, a kind of across the across Europe, who are a little bit ahead of us in terms of this kind of politics. And I think it's important that we bring this concept here because it is a positive solution. We don't have to just accept the trends as they are. We don't just have to, oh, Trudeau brought them here. What are we going to do now? Like, we can wield the state and wield power to ends that benefit our people. So remigration includes a wide variety of policies. This could take the form of things like a moratorium on immigration, a pause on all new immigrants coming here, things like abolishing the temporary foreign workers program and sending them back, things like restricting birthright citizenship to clamp down on things like birth tourism. Currently, if an illegal migrant or a tourist has a child in Canada, that child gets Canadian citizenship and then can be used as a kind of anchor to bring more and more chain migration amongst their immediate family. This is a clear abuse of our laws, and these things should be changed. But also, just in general, making Canadian law more geared towards the benefit of Canadians, not the benefit of newcomers, by restricting access to social services for new immigrants. Making sure they pay into taxes for a certain amount of time before they have access to healthcare, education, all of our social support systems. Putting a remittance tax on any money leaving the country to go back to family abroad. Um, Adopting some inspiration from Quebec and imposing stricter language laws on public signage and symbols, visible religious symbols in schools and other public employees. So there's a wide range of policies that I think need to be adjusted and adopted by a prospective Canadian government to kind of create a comprehensive framework for remigration as the only solution to mass immigration, which I really think is a dire situation. But unfortunately, I don't think any political party goes far enough. The PPC is certainly the closest. We have seen a bit of a pivot since the election from Pierre Poilievre, who's kind of embraced this concept of net negative migration, which is definitely a step in the right direction. But no politician has said the word remigration. No one is pushing this. Maxime Bernier has been pushing an immigration moratorium and deportations of illegal immigrants. But I don't think this goes far enough, really, to reverse the trend. There's probably around, according to government projections, it's around 20,000 to 500,000 illegal immigrants across the country, a pretty wide range. A lot of experts say it's probably even higher than that. But there's millions more that actually need to go back if we're going to protect the Canadian nation. And there are a wide variety of tools that would allow that, as long as we had bold politicians that weren't worried about political correctness and they were willing to wield the power of the state to actually do what's in our best interest.
Mm. And I think one of the natural ways in which this can be spoken about people who maybe have a fairly superficial worldview is simply something very practical like home ownership, where it was not as difficult for a new family to purchase a home in our country. Now it's virtually impossible to do so. And I think we need to recognize that simply allowing the housing market to become something that is expanded according to the self-serving political parties that have a vested interest in transforming the population in order to secure their own power is extremely short-sighted. It's extremely short-sighted for our children and our grandchildren, that they would be in a context where they wouldn't be able to purchase a home. And many in PEI, from what I understand, there's been recognition that in order to purchase property on the island, you have to already be a long-term resident, right? And the idea is they don't actually want their historic homeland to be taken over by by other countries, like, for example, a city like Vancouver has no real relation to the people who founded it, right? And so I think that there needs to be some clear-headed thinking about this. It's one thing to have ideals, but also the discipline of just saying we're going to start from where we are with a clear-headed realism and start to just work with what we have and stop digging this hole that we're digging ourselves into.
Yeah. I mean, the consequences of mass immigration affect every aspect of Canadian society. And this is how I got so focused on this issue in the first place. Kind of throughout my university education in politics, I kept realizing that kind of all the main problems in Canadian society all all lead back to immigration, whether it's the housing crisis, whether it's our dysfunctional healthcare system, whether it's overcrowded classrooms, whether it's inflation and unemployment. Everything ends up back at immigration. It's not necessarily the sole cause, but it is a massive driver of all of these major issues in Canadian society. Uh, Not to mention, it's a quick fix. Closing our doors and not admitting new people does not take some big fight in parliament. It doesn't take multiple levels of government cooperating and all the other things that create kind of gridlock in our political processes. And yet it's hardly discussed by any politician or political party. And housing is a really important example, because one of the main justifications for pushing and increasing immigration numbers is our kind of age demographics of our population, and the declining birth rates of heritage Canadians. But conversely, we see that an essential reason for a lot of heritage Canadians to not be having children is because they can't establish themselves. They can't find a good job, buy a house, and then start a family within that house. This is something previous generations were able to do easily on a reasonable salary and saving for a few years. It's just out of reach of your average Canadian in the current context. And then they use this lack of access to housing creates a disincentive to or delays starting families, which creates this fertility crisis, which they use as justification to bring in more immigrants, which pours fuel on the fire of the housing crisis and puts housing even further out of reach. And it creates this negative cycle that benefits immigrants who get to come from poorer countries to Canada and take advantage of our safety and social security and all these things, while negatively impacting heritage Canadians. And it's a completely toxic cycle, but it just keeps on getting worse and worse, especially under the Trudeau government, which just brought immigration into kind of overdrive. So this is not acceptable. This is what I mean when we need to take a nationalist kind of perspective. They view things from a completely economic standpoint, whereas bringing in more immigrants increases GDP and improves the economy, but it hurts access to health to housing for our people. And there's not that same kind of economic metric that goes with it. But we can agree that it's fundamentally wrong for a state to create the conditions where its own people cannot buy houses, have shelter, and start a family. Like, it seems like one of the most basic things that a state should provide for its people. But instead, we have these politicians that just view things through an internationalist framework, an economic framework, instead of putting the people first. And I think this is fundamentally wrong, and we need to demand better from our politicians.
Completely agree. And changing the subject a little bit, when you think about what it will take in order for Canadians to insist upon these things from their leaders, it seems as though recovering a sense of who we are is foundational, and therefore a sense of our history. Could you maybe talk about that? How is being grounded in Canadian history important for recovering a nationalist consciousness and the will to preserve our nation for future generations?
Well, uh, to properly understand the nation, the people of Canada, an understanding of history is like so important. Or else it's easy to take on this kind of post nationalist view of society, where anyone from anywhere can do anything and be Canadian and all these things. to really understand what the nation is, who the nation is. You need to understand where we came from, and that comes from an understanding of history. And your average Canadian, I find, has a very poor historical literacy. Uh, or I think our education system is rather poor, and not narrowly focused on Canadian history. There's a lot of coverage of international history and the world wars and all this instead of a real deep dive into Canadian history. I find the common take is just Canadian history is boring because it's not all about wars and stuff like this. But I think Canadian history is very unique and very fascinating. The kind of compromise that led to the foundation of the Canadian state and the evolution of our political system uh, over time, and the kind of merging of these different European ethnic groups and political systems into what we have now. So I think there's a lot to be learned uh, in post Confederation Canadian history and pre Confederation Canadian history. A lot of people just cut it off at 1867 when Canada was first established, but the reality is Canada's roots go far deeper than that. The first explorers, European explorers, found Canada slightly before the 1600s, and established permanent settlements in Canada in the early 1600s, 400 years ago. And kind of understanding that entire context is what builds those roots into our society. And it's through those roots that we build stability in our views. So I really recommend to anyone doing a bit more reading and understanding where we came from if you really want to understand where we should be going and how the foundations of a kind of nationalist worldview.
Thank you. That's very helpful. And I think it is telling that the anti-white ideology of the Trudeau government got to such a fervor that under his watch, you had the tearing down of statues from John A. Macdonald. And sadly enough, even conservative governments on the provincial level not really rising to oppose that until very recently. It was through the challenge of the Trump administration to Canadian sovereignty that even the Liberal government under Carney has had to readjust that a bit. And now it's suddenly like, oh, we need to dust off that statue of John A. Macdonald. We can't be going so hard against the founding of Canada and its history that we lose our legitimacy as a distinct entity. But I think that the invitation for us to remember that history is also going to lead to us recovering a deeper sense of the vision of men like John A. Macdonald, who would, I think, be very saddened by how the people that made our country have allowed themselves to be essentially cowed into submission from our ideological enemies. And I don't think that's acceptable. I think that we need to have some self-respect. And part of that is simply having an honest assessment of our own history, recognizing perhaps where there are weaknesses in our history, but not allowing our founders to be denigrated or disrespected. That's a sign of a people that is really being conquered.
Yeah. Like history is not all perfect, but neither is current times. And understanding, like, there is so much inspiration to be had, so much to be learned by going back into our roots. There was really some great men that built this country, and adopting some of their zeal and tenacity, I think, is important. They did have a vision for this place, and it's not what it looks like currently. Um, I think John A. Macdonald's a very important figure that represents a lot of the the beauty and the power of the Canadian people, but also the flaws thereof. And I mean, he his image really drives me as a nationalist. Um, Particularly in this time where uh, uh, controversy with the United States and annexation and all these things has kind of resurged into the public conversation. Um, that's one of the main drivers of what led him to lead the Confederation movement to prevent manifest destiny and prevent the U.S. conquering more of the continent. That's what brought British North America together. Um, Dually, not even just American annexation, in this time where separatist movements are gaining fuel in Alberta and even in Quebec. Um, John A. Macdonald's grand design for a coast to coast distinct Canadian society, I think is a beautiful vision and worth preserving and defending and fighting towards. There's definitely a lot of flaws in modern Canadian society. I understand the grievances of these separatist movements and stuff, but I think we need to work together to maintain the beautiful and unique society that our forefathers built for us.
So, what would you say are some practical ways to help Canadians who are trapped in a kind of intellectual prison of political correctness on these issues? I hope that someone who's listening to this, they can see you may not be completely in agreement with what we're saying, but these are not insane things to agree with. And if there's something that's wrong logically or ethically with what we're saying, for sure, we're public persons. Our names are out there. You're able to interact with us. But for many people, I worry that their response is simply on the emotional level because they've been socialized into a kind of conformity with ideological dogma of political correctness. So, Daniel, supposing that someone that we love is in that situation, they're simply not able to grapple with what we're saying because all they can do is get emotional and sputter that we're just terrible people. How would you seek to help someone that we love who's in such a place?
I mean, at some point, people can only really help themselves. I try and promote these ideas in a clear, well articulated, historically backed way. Having these similar conversations and challenging people. People often have these emotional responses because they're grappling with cognitive dissonance, right? They don't have the complete information, which makes these arguments seem impossible. Um, I would encourage you to try and stick to people that are more open to these views, and as we kind of gain people and normalize our positions, uh these more emotional types will only see we're more and more um reasonable and normal. um you know it's a it's a pathway, it's a rabbit hole, right? And it's easy to have emotional responses when you're kind of grappling with this generational brainwashing kind of propaganda that we are up against in the general population. So um, I don't try and push people too hard. I kind of, you can only lead a horse to water, you can't force them to drink. Um, so I would say continue on making these arguments, um, and eventually, as our as these ideas become more commonplace, as they become more normal, they'll start to come on side. But I would recommend to people to make sure that you have these this kind of intellectual backing when you're communicating these ideas. Like, it's easy to just say inflammatory things about who is and who isn't a Canadian, um, and have the kind of broad strokes. But I encourage anyone that's running up against some pushback from people to do better yourself, to read more, to understand the history and the potential policy solutions and the kind of pragmatic side of things. so that you can have these more challenging conversations in a less emotional light. Um, that's how I try and handle things. I try and make myself the best version I can be. That comes from both the body and the mind. Regular exercise, eating healthy, reading books that provide historical context that challenge the kind of modern liberal worldview, so that I can better articulate my ideas. Uh, because, as I said, you can't force the horse to drink. You can only make it as easy for them as possible.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I believe as a Christian is that we were created to be emotional beings, but the proper way in which emotions should function is when our mind and will are in alignment with the true and the good and the beautiful. And so, if what you find is that you're reacting emotionally to things that are true and just and right, then you need to reassess those things. And I think while it may be the case that in some forums, whether it's X or Facebook, it's hard to communicate that. The reality is that we don't have a dislike for our people who have been socialized to respond in this way. We're in fact your friends. We're desiring your good in this. There's a verse in the book of Galatians where the Apostle Paul says, "Have I become your enemy because I tell you the truth?" Right? And I think that's a very foundational thing. We need to be people of truth in the first place, and then your emotions will not deceive you and lead you in a bad place. So I think what you've said is very helpful for our listeners. Now, when you think about books and other resources that may help people to grapple with the nationalist position, what would be the particular ones that you might recommend?
I have a thread of about this on Twitter. There's for nationalists that are interested in knowing more and better understanding these topics. I do have a little bit of a book list. I would suggest Canada in Decay by Ricardo Duchesne. This is a great book about uh, excuse me, about demographic change and immigration and waves of settlers and such, going back to pre-Confederation history to kind of understand the trends, which helps you understand what a Canadian is and what the country's looked like historically, but also the policy changes that have led us to where we are now. So that's a great book. I would recommend it. Another classic is Lament for a Nation, um, by George Grant. This is uh, one of the kind of seminal works on Canadian nationalism, and it's about how, or George Grant argues that John Diefenbaker was the last bastion of Canadian nationalism. I think his Grant's brand of nationalism is a bit more civic and a bit more economic, and is about the relationship with the United States and our sovereignty being eroded by American influence. Um, so that's a great one to understand kind of that aspect of Canadian nationalism, kind of anti-Americanism. Um, Another great one I would recommend is The Cultured Thug Handbook. This is a kind of guide to illiberal thought. Um, so, kind of unpacking a lot of the ideas that make up the kind of internationalist liberal modern consensus, and giving a more conservative alternative to this worldview. And then I would recommend just various books on Canadian history. Um, Donald Creighton is a noted Canadian historian. He has a lot of works. Um, they're a little bit harder to find. I don't think they're in publish, but you can find them pretty commonly secondhand. Um, I read a great one called Canada's First Century. Um, Pretty self-explanatory on what that's about, but that was a great summary. He also has a couple of biographies on John A. Macdonald and lots of other works on Canadian history. I also just read one called Champlain's Dream, which was a biography on Samuel Champlain, who's the father of New France. Some of and Was a key player in creating sustainable settlements on this continent uh, in the early 1600s. So that was a fascinating read, um, to get a window into pre-Confederation history and really how things got started. Um, but there's tons of examples of interesting books on Canadian history. Um, but yeah, those are a good starting point. I'm also a big fan of uh, the book The Populist Delusion. This is not on Canada in particular, but more kind of on political philosophy and metapolitics and kind of understanding of elite theory and how change is actually made in politics. So that's another good read, a short one too.
Sounds like great recommendations, and some of those pique my interest where it might be good to have you on again to talk about those in greater detail. So
Yeah, for sure, for sure.
thank you
And
for
I
the
I I, I really endorse reading. In this age of scrolling, people put books on the back burner, but I really encourage people to try and start reading something like 10 pages a day, one chapter a day. It is good for the mind, and there's a lot of information that you can find in books that you're missing out on while you scroll TikTok or X or whatever.
excellent. And do you have any final thoughts about how you'd like to see Canadians get involved in furthering nationalist objectives after they listen to this podcast episode?
Well, for one, I just want to rehash what I've kind of been saying. Like you have to keep in mind that the nation is the people, and that starts with you. And the nation, our society, is in poor health right now, but so are our people. So it's a kind of Petersonian advice, kind of clean your room before you save the world. But make sure yourself is healthy. Like make sure you're getting exercise on a daily basis. Make sure you're reading regularly. Clean up your diet. Make sure you're healthy. um, get your life in a good place before you try and save the nation. That would be my first step in what I advocate for everyone. um, in terms of next steps, I'm actually working on building an organization to promote a nationalist framework to promote this concept of remigration. So I encourage you to watch my kind of social media channels over the coming weeks, where we should be going public and announcing this across the country. And I hope to use this organization to be able to help channel people's uh, fervor, people's tenacity into a more productive and professional uh, activities. So that's something that you can all look out for in the coming weeks.
And where can people find your work on social media, sir?
My main platform is X. You can find me there at Daniel Tyrie, just my full name. I also post on Instagram and TikTok. I think my handle there is at DGV Tyrie. But following me on X is probably the best place to find me.
Well, I really appreciate you taking the time, Daniel, and thankful for all that you're doing for our nation. And until next time, listener, God bless.